So funded by the UK government, GIACE, which is Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, works with 14 research teams in generating world-class evidence on anti-corruption initiatives around the world. The program helps inform practitioners' efforts to deliver better outcomes, and we support 14 teams doing research that is problem-driven and rigorous, and particularly designed to inform practitioners' efforts to craft and implement more effective anti-corruption interventions. So in that way, being able to translate this amazing work that Matthew Stevenson has put together into something digital has been a really key part of making all of this amazing resources accessible. Matthew Stevenson is a professor of law at Harvard Law School, and his research focused on the application of positive political theory to public law, particularly in the areas of administrative procedure and anti-corruption. He created the anti-corruption bibliography internally for himself, which I have so many questions about, 10 years ago, and he's been adding it to it ever since, and he went public with it about 6 years ago. Stephen Gawthorpe is a founding member of the Interdisciplinary Corruption Research Network. He received his PhD at Charles University, researching corruption in the public procurement sector of the Czech Republic. And Stephen is one of the key people involved in digitizing the library. So I will hand it off to Johannes Thun, who is the Director of Integrity and Anti-Corruption at Global Integrity and the co-lead for the Anti-Corruption Evidence Program.
Great, thank you, Ambika, and welcome everyone to this official launch of the digital library, which, as Ambika said, we're really excited about after quite a bit of work going into this. I know that the main purpose of this today is not to look back over the next 2 years and sort of, consider and ponder how good we've done, or perhaps how bad we've done over the past 2 years. But I wanted to briefly frame this whole event by making a link between what we do at the Anti-Corruption Evidence Program and how the digital library is one very important spin-off project, if you will. One of the things, so Paul Haywood, who is our program director, Alan Hudson, who is the executive director of Global Integrity, and we sat in a cab leaving Whitehall, the DFID headquarters, then in 2019, and we were pondering about all the many things that are disconnects, that are malfunctions in this anti-corruption space that we all inhibit. And we were wondering, what are the many things, what is the universe of things that we should look at, that we must look at in order to get better at really translating all that existing evidence into actionable pieces that practitioners can run with. How could we strengthen the ties, the links between academics working in one university in one part of the world and civil society in another part of the world? And there were many ideas that came to mind and that continue to come to mind. And one of the things, though, that stuck with us in that cab ride was the idea, look, we have resources such as Matthew's library, which is a huge PDF with exciting research updated frequently. It is an institution that we can work with, and yet in some way or form it's not as optimal as it could be. And coming from our meeting with DFID folks, we thought, well, maybe there's a way to move slightly toward making this open source and making it accessible to more people. And then just a week after or so, Stephen and I talked over the course of the OECD Integrity Forum. And I think we even used Twitter to just double check what we were doing or how different things came together on our side. And essentially over that Twitter chat, we decided, well, let's actually partner on this and try to use Matthew's great work, this huge library, and turn it into something that's useful for other people. And now, about 2 years later, we're very happy to present this result. So I think that's really all I wanted to say on this. Thank you again for joining us, and do provide us with feedback over the next month whenever you use this, so that we can try to make this as useful as possible for everyone. Over to Matthew and Stephen.
Thank you. So Matthew, I know we've talked about this a lot, and you've kind of been very modest about, oh yeah, I was just putting these things together, but it's like 8,500 resources. So I'm sure it wasn't just a small amount of work. So I'm really curious how it actually evolved to the state that it's at, and sort of what made you start to even put this together before you shared it publicly?
Yeah, I'm happy to share the origin story, and it really isn't that exciting or interesting in some ways. I mean, as you just pointed out, Ambika, it grew into this big thing, but that was not the original intent. In fact, this in many ways reflects my own lack of sophistication about the field of corruption when I started. So when I decided I wanted to start working on this topic almost 10 years ago, I'd been working on other projects and I wanted to turn my attention to issues related to especially law and politics in the developing world. And I'd been advised by um, a friend in particular who works in this area that corruption was really a leading central problem that I should think about. I said, well, okay, what's, as an academic, the responsible thing for me to do before I start working out my own research and writing projects is to read the literature, right? I think there are I see a lot of familiar faces on this Zoom call. Many of you are academics or aspiring academics. Like, this is what you're supposed to do. You don't just sit down and start writing. At least you're not supposed to. You should familiarize yourself with the existing scholarship. So I said, okay, I should make myself a reading list. I should go back to graduate school in a sense. Right? I'd been on the Harvard Law School faculty for about 5 or 6 years at that point, but I should do what I did in graduate school, which is to educate myself about the literature. Little did I know how much literature there was, but I kind of thought, well, you know, I'm working on other projects. I'll make myself a reading list. I'll work through it over the next like 6 months to a year. And then like by the end of that time, I'll know the literature. So I made myself a reading list. And I did this by finding syllabi for classes on corruption, by going into the JSTOR database and doing some keyword searches, in the Westlaw database and doing some keyword searches. And I generated an original reading list, which I just printed out and stapled together because I still work often in hard copy, that was about 7 or 8 pages long, which seemed pretty sizable. And as I started, and then, you know, while I was on my commute, I would just like read corruption articles and make little notes to myself about them and check them off my list as I'd read them. And I started doing this, and inevitably every article that I would read, I would look at the bibliography and I would note 3, 4, 5, 6 sources that weren't on my list that looked like they were interesting and I should add them. And I'd put little tick marks next to them, and then I'd go find them and download them and print them out, and I would add to the list. And then this kind of expanded exponentially. And the next thing I knew, my initial reading list that started as about 7 pages long was about 30 pages long. And then it kept getting longer. And at a certain point, I said, you know what, I can't, like, there's just so much stuff. I need to figure out a more efficient way of updating this. And I'm fortunate enough to be affiliated with Harvard University, which has an amazing library system and amazing library staff. And so then the research librarians there basically created an algorithm that every month, like the Harvard Law School or the Harvard University Library gets like a list of titles and abstracts of every new publication that's come in that month. And they just do a keyword search and generate a list. I use a program called Zotero, which, you know, my faculty assistant recommended, which is a citation management system. And I transferred the list from just a Word document to Zotero. And then my library sends me a list every month. I go through it and like eliminate the articles that are actually computer science papers about corruption of data and file transfers, or the medical articles about bone grafts, both of which get picked up by my keyword search for things like corruption and graft. And then I add them. And then at some point, I honestly don't remember how long ago, it occurred to me that it would have been really useful when I was starting out as a researcher if someone had already done what I had done, which is to put together this gigantic set of sources and like put it in one place. So I just uploaded it to my faculty website. And since, as some of you know, I run a blog on anti-corruption topics, since I update this every month, I just post an update saying the new thing is available. But especially as it got really large, I'm Becca, you're right about this. It's now like a 700-page thing. Like, I don't know how many pages it would be if you actually tried to print it out, like with thousands and thousands of sources. And it's a giant PDF document, which is not particularly useful. Right? Like, this was totally fine when it was a 7-page thing. It was just a reading list. But now it really is like a compendium of sources, at least English language sources on corruption, anti-corruption. And, you know, you can do a keyword search. You can do a Control F and type in a word, but it's not sorted by topic. It's not sorted by region or country. There's certainly like no keyword searches or anything. But like, I just don't have time or expertise to do anything other than that. So like, it just was what it was. And then, and now I'll come to the end of the origin story part of this discussion, which is probably not that interesting for most people. The good people at Global Integrity approached me and said, like, you have this thing, can we make it useful? I mean, they were too polite to put it in those terms, but that was really the upshot. Like, we take this big mass of sources and turn it into something that someone could actually use in an effective way. And I, of course, said, yes, that sounds like a great idea. I don't know how, and I don't have the time, but if you can, that would be amazing. And they did. And that brings us to the thing that exists that Stephen is about to describe in more detail, how the library is actually set up and what functions it has. I'll just mention briefly now, but maybe we can talk about this more going forward, to connect this to the larger agenda for global integrity and the anti-corruption evidence program, which I think is terrific. I do think it's vitally important for those of us who work in the research community to find ways to make our collective research findings more accessible and useful to the world at large. And this is challenging in part because, as I discovered, there's so much of it. And actually synthesizing it and figuring out what we know and what we don't know is a big challenge. And one for which I hope this library is a useful first step, but only a first step, because I really do think that one of the things that we collectively need to figure out how to do is how to, again, organize and synthesize and critically evaluate the substance of the work that's out there, so we can provide some semblance of like evidence for people who want to do evidence-based policymaking or evidence-based advocacy, which I think every sensible person would want to do. I mean, I really, and again, this is a theme, my naivete is a kind of a running theme here. I kind of had this idea that I would do that. Like, I would read the literature and then I could do the synthetic treatment. And I still aspire to do something like that, but there's just too much. There's just too much. And I think we need to figure out collectively a way, not just to do our own original research, which is vitally important, but a way to go through the massive research that's been done and figure out what we know and what we don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I started getting to the corruption business, I would go to a lot of these conferences and I would hear people say things in like keynote speeches along the lines of, nobody knows anything about X. We really need someone to do research on X, where in fact, there are like 15 articles on X. Or someone would say, we know the following thing about X. Studies have shown that, and make some assertion. I was like, well, some studies have kind of shown that, but like there are a lot of other studies that like show different things, or you know what I'm saying. And so I feel like we collectively as the research community need to find ways to better synthesize, process, and present this material so that the very busy people in advocacy and policy who really want to have evidence-based approaches have something solid to draw from. And I feel like this library doesn't do that because it's only a way to search for materials and organize materials. But I think it's an essential first step in doing that. And so I'm really grateful to GI and ACE and Stephen and everyone else who was involved in taking what, again, was just my own personal reading list that grew to unwieldy size and converting it into what I hope will turn out to be a useful resource for researchers all over. So that's all I got to say. Let me turn it over to Stephen, who can talk more about the actual library and how it can be used.
Awesome. Matthew, that wasn't boring in the least, and it was really fascinating to hear, though I did love Johannes's cab story, which I never heard about till today either. So I'm learning a lot. Stephen, I'm going to hand it off to you, but I'd love for you to actually start before you even show some of the use cases. If you could just start with like why or how you decided to take on this project and where the idea came from. And it's, you know, it's a very, very ambitious technical project. And so I'm curious, like how it came into your mind.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. I appreciate the wonderful introduction and the opportunity from Global Integrity to work on this project. It's really fantastic. So, yeah, I got an interest in this. I've been an avid reader of the Global Anti-Corruption blog, and I would see these monthly PDF releases from the bibliography that Matthew would put out. And I'm a senior data scientist at UNODC, and I work mainly with natural language processing and unstructured data. And I think there was a particular boring day where I thought it'd be interesting to try to parse the PDF and digitize it. And I thought, you know, what could we do with this resource? Like, how could we make it accessible? How could we milk additional information that would be very much in line with what Matthew was discussing? You know, trying to get a overall sense of the subject matter of corruption, and you know, try to try to make it much easier to access this type of information. So that was one of the challenges that I undertook, and shared it with Johannes, which, by the way, I never heard the cab story either, I should point out. But yeah, I randomly tweeted over to Johannes that I had I parsed out Matthew's 600-page PDF and turned it into a nice data frame, and said that I would share it. And then we kind of started to discuss, you know, how we could build an application around it and what other features we could get out of it. And so that's kind of the starting point, was basically the challenge of just trying to take Matthew's idea and you know, milk it for more value and more you know, more research, I guess, potential as a whole. So yeah.
It's awesome. You want to show us some of the use cases or how you would kind of navigate it?
Yeah, sure. So let me share the screen here. Right. So actually, I'm going to show you two use cases. And the first use case actually is an event that actually happened while working at the UNODC. I had a colleague that was asking me to put together just, you know, some recommended articles on organized crime and corruption, and she wasn't particularly familiar with the subject matter. And while we were discussing this, I thought, hey, you know, I was prototyping this application, and I was like, why don't we, you know, use the app that I've developed? And so what I did was put together in a search organized crime, and this is a general mutual exclusive inclusive type of search. So it searches across all various fields of organized crime. So I pulled out a search that came up with 73 results. Now, that would be too much as a, you know, recommended resource list, right? So there's, you know, we could whittle this down and, you know, kind of refine this a little bit further by looking at the type and just restricting it just to journal articles, right? And we could try to make some of the years a little bit more recent. And so what I did was kind of whittled this down to a manageable 14 results. And in the app, you can export whatever query you enter, or whatever your search is. So if we export this search across all these different fields, you get a spreadsheet that looks like this. So nice CSV file with all the authors, the title information. You get a full abstract, all the links, everything that you would need to kind of put together a nice resource list for someone. So this is just one particular use case. I think that would be interesting for someone that's not an experienced corruption researcher, but just wants to get a quick, you know, kind of overview. So I'll reset this. And so that's one type of common use case that would use. So I can provide a second use case that you might use for a general, like more experienced corruption researcher. And so for that, again, I'll use the sidebar. And in this project, I created an algorithm that creates keywords that are very specific to corruption nomenclature, all the terms that we're familiar with. This algorithm comes up with key terms that you don't commonly find in other digital library searches, right? It might be a little bit too esoteric. So this is something that I put a lot of work in to try to make it, you know, honed specifically for the corruption researcher. So in this example, let's say we have a person that's interested in informal institutions and corruption, right? So there's a large number of keywords that are parsed from the abstract, and we could type in something like Guangxi or Guangxi networks, type Blatt, and I grew up in the Middle East, and I'm very familiar with WASTA, as I'm sure there's probably lots of people in the chat discussion that are familiar with it as well. And so this would be a good example for someone that's trying to get a good overview on something very specific to corruption that can help identify potential literature gaps by looking at the resources from the search. One of the things that I'm very happy about is this open access button, which if you're someone that doesn't have access to proprietary scholarly articles, the open access button attempts to find an open source equivalent of the article. And you can test it out here, and can see, I think I already have it opened up, but yeah, so if you're someone that doesn't have access to these articles, that the open access button will provide an open source equivalent here, as you can see. So this is one example. Another interesting feature from this is if you're performing this type of research while you're writing an article, you can, there's a cite button that you can use, and you can select various citation styles, and you can copy it to a clipboard. And so while you're writing or whatever, you can copy and paste here into a Word document, kind of doing your citations as you go. So that's a few examples here. And yeah, another, maybe one of the last things that I would show, and then could maybe move on to dealing with specific questions on how to use this application. But one of the other interesting things is you can click on a specific journal and try to identify particular journals that pertain to your subject matter, and so that could help you find out which journal is appropriate for your next next submission. So yeah, that's a quick overview on my side. So
awesome, thank you so much. Your co-technical lead, if you can stop sharing the screen, your co-technical lead, Joseph, is also on the call. Joseph, did you want to say anything or add anything about stuff as well? Or if you, Stephen, want to talk a little bit about your relationship and how Joseph got involved?
Maybe I can quickly say, while Joseph tries to prepare to discuss that, yeah, parsing a 600-page PDF was was not easy. So Joseph was instrumental in helping me try to get all of the data and make sure that it's up to particular quality. And it also kind of helped me from the technical standpoint, just focus on why we would try to digitize this information and what would be the best areas to try to provide for researchers. So it was a very good dynamic and to have him on board. So I don't know if you're there, but
Yeah, I texted him, so it's fine. He may not be there. He said, connecting on my commute, everyone, sorry. But we really appreciate you still joining on the call. I just had a couple of questions, but I know everyone else really has a lot of stuff to ask and sort of talk about. But I guess my thing, I just curious, like what your biggest challenges were in doing this. Not the technical challenges, but like I think going back to what you were saying, Matthew, about like how everything is so spread apart and that it's like it's really hard to get it together. Did you have trouble like finding things, or like where did you get stuck, or was it just always there?
Well, so in some ways, this is an easier question for me to answer because, again, I didn't create this with a specific objective to produce a library of resources that would be useful to researchers in the world. I'm thrilled that that's the direction the project has gone. It turned out to be more socially useful than I'd anticipated, only because of the efforts of Stephen and Joseph and everyone else, and Johannes and everyone else at GI and ACE. So for me, again, it started just kind of snowballing. I did kind of like, again, what most people would do. Again, a lot of academics or aspiring academics on this call, you want to learn about a particular field. If I said your next research project is going to be X, there's certain things that you would do to make a list of things that you should read about X, and I just did that. And then I looked at bibliographies and added stuff. And then thanks to the Harvard Library System, I mean, I talked to them about keywords to use, and then I just get a huge amount of stuff just dumped on me every month that I go through. So I'm sure there are plenty of things that I miss. One of the nice things actually about having gotten some more general attention from the anti-corruption community about this is usually after my monthly update to the bibliography that I post on the blog, I'll get a few emails from people saying, hey, can you add this thing to the bibliography, which is great. Again, I'm sure there are things that are missing, but yeah, I mean, there's no objective that I have, and it wasn't other than just collect stuff that seems relevant. So for me, the biggest challenges are ones that don't have to do with the library itself. It's now that it's become apparent how big it is. It's figuring out what to do with it. Right? How we can collectively process all this information in ways that actually make it useful, which requires going beyond just sort of sorting through the sources. It actually requires reading them and figuring out if they're any good and figuring out what they say. But in terms of the material itself, I mean, there weren't any particularly big challenges that I faced because I was just gradually accumulating material that seemed like it would be relevant. So I'll throw it over to Stephen, who I think might have something more interesting to say about the challenges of, as he was saying, taking this 700-page behemoth and turn it into something that would be useful as a library as opposed to just as a long document.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what you were saying there, Matthew, that yeah, it's also interesting too, because one of the major trends I'd say within the last year or 10 years of corruption research is a discussion on how anti-corruption efforts have failed over and over and over again. And again, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of efforts to kind of map out everything that's been done in corruption research. One of the there's some articles that go back to the 1960s that are discussing municipal corruption and local corruption that are in the corpus that are something that aren't commonly cited and something that's kind of like overlooked. So I'd say that that's one of the particular advantages, that you can get a good overview of the meta information that's been provided in this corpus. So in terms of the specific challenges, that it was very much a challenge to try to map out all of the key terms and keywords from all of the abstracts. So if any of you are using the application right now, you'll notice that there are a lot of keywords, and this was intentionally designed so that I don't map them in a particular way that would exclude people from combining certain categories of political corruption or corruption, and they could kind of use these combinations for their own search purposes. That was definitely a challenge to try to extract that from this body. Yeah.
Let me jump in with just one additional observation, and it will really become a plug more than anything else, which is that, I think, Matthew, you're obviously right that it is a huge challenge how to synthesize this information, how to translate all the different disparate findings and make sure that there's a coherent body of intelligible knowledge that is really at the fingertips of people really working on this. But at the same time, it is obviously also the responsibility of any practitioner or academic student to make sense and now be able to access the database that we have in some way or form collaboratively created there and make accessible. But I think one other piece, and that is at a slightly elevated dimension or at a slightly elevated level, is precisely the work that you do and that Stevens ICRN network do with the Kickback podcast. So I find the Kickback podcast is truly fantastic because it precisely does that. It synthesizes, it sort of hones in on a particular question that we have in the anti-corruption research and in the field, whether it's from a practitioner perspective, from an academic perspective, whether it comes from a methodological point of view or from a theory-led point of view. And it dives in and explores a particular topic, sets some boundaries around that topic, explores the different arguments that are being proposed, and challenges some of the findings that are there. And I think that is one of those very concrete pieces that I feel, very, very aptly builds on this whole notion of knowing that there is a body of research and a body of findings that we can build on to then try and synthesize these things and produce them or lay them out in a format that is accessible to different people. So just to say kudos and thank you for both your work on this and also I think the collective interdisciplinary corruption research network, which consists of other people. Stephen is a co-founder, but there are other people just as well that are making this particular podcast so valuable precisely for that reason, to synthesize research and present it in useful forms.
Thanks for the plug. A new episode of Kickback just came out a couple days ago with an interview with Robert Barrington, currently a professor of practice at Sussex, but formerly the executive director of Transparency International's UK office. He's got a really fascinating discussion of many things, including the efforts to lobby for the UK Bribery Act and the UK's public register of beneficial ownership. So everyone take a listen if you haven't yet. Robert is really, really interesting.
Awesome. I just wanted to hand it over to Paul Haywood.
Thanks very much. Slightly worried this is going to become some kind of dreadful mutual appreciation session where we all clap each other on the back and say what a fantastic job we've done. But it is awesome. I mean, I think it is a really amazing resource. And thanks, Stephen, for running through some of its functionality there. And let me endorse everything that's been said about what a brilliant resource it turned into from Matthew's initial investigation into finding out about what's been published on corruption. I guess one of the great things about it from my perspective, at least I hope this is what allows people to do, is that because it's so wide-ranging, it might help us move away from the tendency that exists at the moment in a huge number of pieces that I get sent to look at by journals, and I'm sure Matthew gets the same, and I'm sure others have exactly the same experience. So people set out and they do their bibliographic search on what's been published. And I was talking to Alina Munjo-Pipidi about this, and she had this great analogy. It's a bit like everybody now uses a sat-nav, but they don't know how to read a map. And so the kind of Web of Science or the Google Scholar or whatever Scopus type of bibliographical search throws up all kinds of things, but it misses so much. And I think one of the fantastic things about this kind of bibliography is that it's so much more wide-ranging. And so if you're really wanting to find out what's being published in a particular area, you're much more likely to get the kinds of insights that are useful, sensible from something like this than you will get from doing a kind of a Google Scholar search, which, you know, by nature of the algorithms it uses, is going to miss masses. So this is not only just a fantastic resource in its own right, but hopefully will lead to better research, which in turn will lead to more useful outputs. So thank you very much, everybody who was involved in putting it together.
Yeah, having spent time with Stephen on this, I think Mutual Appreciation Day is very much appreciated for this project. So it's a huge task, and I think two of the questions that just came up have to do with that. One is how authors, and I actually think this question's for both Matthew and Stephen, how authors can add abstracts and keywords to their publications for the library. So I guess the question, and I think both of these questions are connected. Abiola also wanted to know how your search tool is set up and how to navigate it. So essentially, like, I think what people are asking is, if you have a resource, how do you make sure that your keywords and your abstracts are correct on the resource, on the library?
Sorry, could you cut off for 1 second? Could you just repeat that last?
Yeah, so there's two questions, and I think that they're connected. Shazka wanted to know how authors can add abstracts and keywords to their publications, which is like goes back into your conversation about the keywords. And then Abiola wanted to know how you set up the search tool. So I think both of those things are like interconnected.
Right. So the keywords, the way that I developed it is that when you're trying to extract most of the citation information from these articles, some places will provide keywords and others will not. Sometimes there's the Web of Science keywords that are already managed, and then there's the author keywords, which are separate. And this was kind of complicated to, and then most often keywords are missing, especially when it comes to books and book chapters and so forth. So to kind of deal with this challenge, I just created a feature extraction that would just work universally across all abstracts. And like I mentioned before, I tried as best as possible not to narrow the terms too much to where people wouldn't be able to disentangle what the words are relative to other terms. So this was meant so that you could kind of combine various key terms that are parsed and kind of put them together. So like in the example I showed, Guangxi and Guangxi networks, you could combine that as one category, and that would be up to the researcher to do so. If anyone wants to have a discussion on the design of the keywords or has any suggestions, I'm open to a discussion on that. So for the most part, that was my intention for creating this list of keywords. And then the searches, how the search was designed, again, was kind of up to my discretion. Like I showed you, I tried to have a general search bar that would just kind of search across all fields, and you can just kind of type and press enter. Or on the sidebar, you can hone in on a particular author or type or year or number of citations. And yeah, that was my intention. I hope I answered those questions sufficiently. So.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to come on to ask anyone questions, it's a fairly intimate group, and everyone's Joke, totally killing the pronunciation of your name. Would you like to come on to ask your question?
Yes, thanks. Very interesting. I wonder just if there is a sort of categorization of sources in the database, like academic journals, books, or cases, or whatever. Do you understand the question? If you have a division of the type of sources in it.
Yeah, on the if you go to the web application and you click on the open up the sidebar, there's a type field, and there it shows all the exhausted categories for document type. And I tried to, from all the various resources that I parsed from, I tried to map, normalize all the names to those settings, to book, chapter, journal article, and so forth. So there's different names for those document types. So I tried as best as possible to kind of standardize it just to the ones that you see listed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just had a question actually for you, Matthew. It kind of goes back to what you were saying about this being used for practical purposes and policy purposes. And I guess it's a twofold question. One is if you've had, I see how many fans you have when you post these and everyone's like, this is great. Have you ever had people reach out to you and say, hey, I was able to specifically use this for X purpose who weren't academics? Like, do you ever feel like policymakers are using this? And also if they're not, when the resource is this big, what do you kind of your recommendations or suggestions for policymakers or academics to kind of navigate how to use this together? Or is it just for academics? And then, I just wanted to know sort of your thinking behind that.
Yeah, honestly, I can't think of an example where a policymaker has said this was really useful for this particular thing. There's a selection bias because people who think something's really stupid tend not to come up to your face and say, I think this is a really stupid waste of time. Whereas people who like it will tend to say, I like it. So people have said, I like it. And that includes policymakers and activists. It's like, oh yeah, this is so useful. I don't know if they really is useful to them or not, but like, I don't know, it's there. In terms of, but your second question is a more important question, I think, and it's the one that goes maybe beyond the library as such, and it connects to what we were talking about before. How can we as the research community take this library as a foundation and create something that's really useful for activists, policymakers, and others? I mean, I do think that just the library would be useful for policymakers and activists if you want to know, is it the case that raising civil service salaries tends to reduce administrative bribery? There have been like a dozen academic studies on that. So, and they're in different places, as Paul was suggesting. They might not all show up on Google Scholar. And thanks to Stephen, you could go onto this thing and type in a few relevant keywords and pull up, a score of articles that deal with that issue. So that's good. The problem, though, and this gets at what I was saying before, is that you won't just find like one article that's got the definitive answer to that question. You'll get like 12 articles that have different answers to that question, that study different places, use different methodologies, different data sources, and don't necessarily come up with consistent answers, and also will be of varying quality. Some of them will be actually really excellent, really well done studies, and others will be, less good. I'm looking for a good euphemism to use here. And I'm a professional academic. I've lived my whole life in the ivory tower, and that's fine, and I love it, and it's great. But even I find it rather overwhelming to try to process all this material and read all the articles sufficiently carefully to come to my own conclusion about like what the answer is. And by the answer, it's not just like what we know, it could be like what we know and what we don't know, and so forth. And so if I had a full-time job as, at an aid agency or at UNODC or the World Bank or an activist group like Global Integrity or Transparency International, there's no realistic way I could do this. So if I was engaged in some kind of advocacy project and I wanted to know, does raising civil service salaries help? Or, is it the case that providing more transparent information about the extractive industry genuinely reduces the extent of corruption? Like, I don't know how I would be able to do it really, even with the library. With the library might enable me to find 12 to 15 articles or more on this topic, but I would still need the time to go through them all and the expertise to sort the good stuff from the bad stuff, or how to synthesize different studies that get at different aspects of the topic. And I feel like one of the things that we as the research community should do more of and should be better at is doing this work of synthesis. And it's a challenge for a few reasons. One of the reasons it's a challenge is, again, it's very time consuming. It requires a lot of expertise and different kinds of expertise. Another is that, and I'm sure this will resonate with the professors on the call, the career incentives of academia are not set up to reward review and synthesis and processing of material that's already out there. The reward structure is designed to encourage original work, which is great in some sense, as it should, because you really want to reward people who are pushing the envelope and uncovering new knowledge. But it does mean that there's not a lot of career incentive to spend months or years of your life, pouring through the previous material and trying to process it and synthesize it. But that does mean that what we collectively produce might not be as useful to the practitioner community as it could be. I do think there are some research organizations and advocacy groups that do put some effort into this. So Transparency International has its help desk and Ask the Experts. The U4 Center in Bergen in Norway has another kind of like ask us questions sort of things. And those are great. But they are a bit more limited. I mean, I've looked at some of their outputs and they're terrific and I love them, but they do tend to rely of necessity on a relatively smaller number of sources. And often they're providing answers and kind of like the whole idea is a rapid turnaround. So I do think that it would be great if, building on the foundation established by the library that Global Integrity and ACE have now put together, is if this is a kind of a fantasy a bit, but bear with me, people on the call, if like some consortium of academics could like come together and figure out an appropriate division of labor to do what I've been trying to do solo for the last couple of years and realize there's no way I'm going to be able to do it realistically by myself. And that's to come up with some system for reading, carefully, critically evaluating and processing this material so we can produce documents that will be of use to the policy community. And I do think one thing that would be really nice, actually, is that there are great academic literature reviews, there are terrific help desk answers, but they tend to be static documents that can become outdated fairly quickly, right? Over the next couple of years, new studies come out. So like my fantasy scenario is to create some kind of online compendium of like a summary of the state of the art of our knowledge on anti-corruption that could be not like full wiki where anyone can just change it, but where it could be regularly updated by a community of scholars who really know what's going on, so that as new material shows up, you could even use the GI library to like show me everything that's on this topic within the last year or something like that, to go through and regularly update that document. I think that would be really useful. I don't know how we could do it exactly. Again, I had this fantasy of doing it myself, and then again, this is a recurring pattern with me, if you guys have picked up on probably. Like, no, that was naive to think that I could do this. There's way too much stuff, and I just don't have the time or the expertise to do it. But I think if we could somehow collectively find ways to process the information that's in the bibliography, the library, that would be the thing, because I think would be most useful in addressing your question, which is how do we get this in a form that would be super useful to policymakers. I do hope that policymakers, or maybe more realistically, the people providing those help desk or ask the expert answers, can already use this, right? That whoever at U4 TI gets the question, they can not only rely on what they already know, but they can immediately go to the library and type it in and say, oh, gosh, in addition to the 6 source studies I already knew on this, there are like 10 other studies that I hadn't seen. Let me at least skim those quickly before I write up the help desk answer. I think that would be really, that would be like the most direct short-term way that it could happen. And my fantasy longer term scenario, if anyone's interested, let's talk.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Isabella, I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, and I just put my question in the chat for reference. So essentially what you're already saying, when a big organization such as the bank does some projects, whether it be operational or just advisory services analytics, they do the due diligence of a literature review, but oftentimes they just hire a consultant and they're like, hey, just do this, done, check the box. How can they do that better? And not just the bank, but other organizations, funders, and policymakers. How can they better access this type of resource? And just a thought, perhaps by leveraging the existing relationship with organizations such as Global Integrity could be one way. But raising the visibility is basically my question.
Yeah, Johannes or Paul, did you want to kind of jump in on that?
So I'm happy to take a stab at this, but probably not with the answer that you would expect. So I think the big question, whether there's the World Bank, whether it is civil society organization, and it goes back to Matthew's point, practitioners across the board, whether it's the State Department, our friend Sky putting together, pieces on police corruption. The big question that needs to be clarified, and that is an internal iterative process, is what is the objective that particular organization, that particular person really has. And oftentimes any research process or any policy making process or any policy implementation process starts with this rather large, sort of somewhat undefined, fuzzy objective. Oh, we got to do something on this and that. But sort of honing in on what is it we actually know? Do we have a particular theory of how we would get from our observation of the state of affairs to what we need to learn, where we need to take action in order to then observe whether we're really getting to meaningful results that speak to this initial objective that we had observed? That is an iterative process. And oftentimes, I think, practitioners more so than academics, but including academics, are likely to try to have a shortcut there and say, oh, I'll define an objective, and then come what may, I'll have to answer that particular piece. And I won't allow myself the mental flexibility to really go back and go in feedback loops and say, oh, what have I learned today? Let me step back from this again. Are my questions still correct? Are my assumptions correct? Have I shared those assumptions with the people around me, whether it's my organization or fellow academics? And am I really applying full due diligence on answering that question? At the same time, that is something that can also be driven to the extreme. And obviously there is no use in any of us trying to labor 10 years or 15 years to do a particular policy or put a particular paper out. So there is a pragmatic, practical consideration of how far to drive this idea of double checking the work that we're doing, making explicit the assumptions. But I think that is the key thing that would help both practitioners in the World Bank, UNODC, anywhere, to really understand, can I put a objective on paper and then carefully clarify with my surrounding policy people, is that really the thing we're trying to get to then carefully look at the evidence that is out there and make progress toward justifying whether both objective and the expected theory of, or the assumed theory of getting there, whether that's really correct.
Sheska had a question about news sources. And I know that the news sources sort of flow from Matthew to Stephen in terms of the workflow. How do news sources get added to the library, Matthew? And like, can people submit things to add? And are you going to start adding podcasts and videos and things like that?
Yeah, so a couple questions there. So in terms of how things get added, again, right now it's pretty low tech, as it were. So my library sends me a bunch of stuff every month. It's based on their keyword searches, and I go through those, as I said, and prune the things that are not relevant, but they're sort of false positives because of similar seeming keywords. And then people send me stuff. Now, and then I enter it. So sometimes it's easy because they send me stuff with a link, and I click on the link, it opens the page, and I click add to Zotero, and it automatically adds it. Sometimes it's a bit more work because it doesn't have a link or doesn't have a page online, or the page is just like a web page that doesn't have the embedded information. And then I have to like manually type it in. So right now, every month, I usually receive somewhere between like 0 and 6 sources that people just send to me with a request to add. So like, that's not that much trouble. Like sometime when my brain is just burned out on other writing, I'll just feel productive by, instead of like surfing the web, I'll enter in the new bibliography stuff. Like, that's fine. If this really took off and I was getting like 30 new things every month that I needed to enter by hand, yeah, that would be less good from my perspective. But really, again, it's very like, people just email me and say, hey, I saw your bibliography, my latest article, I'd love it if you could include it in the next update. what I would like to happen eventually, just putting all the cards on the table, now that GI and ACA have created this amazing, wonderful library, and as I'm starting to reach a stage in my career when I'm starting to think about like what's the next thing that I want to be working on, I would love to be able to hand this off entirely to the good people at Global Integrity and retire into the sunset. Especially because like once this thing exists and once all the bugs have been completely worked out and it's totally like everything is set, there's no point in having an 800-page PDF document that just lists everything alphabetically. Presumably, if one wanted such a thing, it could be auto-generated. I assume this is true, Stephen. Like if someone wanted to actually take everything in the library and just create a long list to have it, I assume that's either already doable or that function could easily be added. It would just be reverse engineering what you've already done. And so like then I would hope that and what I mean by this is not just that like someone else could take over the process of receiving emails and manually entering it, but it would be great if demand is high enough to create some form where people can automatically enter a source that they would like to see added to the bibliography. And there's got to be some quality control. Presumably someone at GI would need to like scan these things and make sure they're not duplicative, that they're relevant, and there's nothing else wrong with them, and just auto add them. I think that would be a nice thing to do going forward. And again, and then to turn to your other question in terms of podcasts and videos and such, the current answer is no. Those aren't there. I don't have plans to add them right now, but that's not to say they shouldn't be. And I have to say, there are other things that are not there either, like blog posts are not there. Other kinds of just like policy report things are not there. And again, part of this is just path dependence. So the origin of the project, as I said, was like at that point, a young academic, now a less young academic, but a young academic trying to like figure out what's the scholarly literature that I should read and be familiar with before I start doing my own project. And so the focus was on the kinds of material that, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, get cited in academic articles. So I was looking at books and book chapters and journal articles, and occasionally like big weighty policy reports put out by places like the World Bank. I mean, I wasn't doing, like if there's a Transparency International issue brief or help desk answer, I wasn't including that just because, I don't know, there wasn't like I didn't think this through. It just didn't seem like that was a scholarly source that would go in. Thinking more broadly, again, now that GI has taken my original personal reading list and taken it to the next level to create a useful database and resource or library, I actually think maybe, yeah, it would be a good idea to expand it to a broader range of sources that the relevant community might want to use. You know, much like physical libraries eventually started adding, you know, DVDs before they became obsolete. And especially as now serious academic journal articles cite to blog posts and cite to videos. So, you know, again, I started doing this 10 years ago and wasn't really thinking about what it was for. I will say, and this connects this thought to the previous thought, one of the reasons I originally restricted myself was because I just didn't want to get overwhelming. Like if I said, okay, blog posts on corruption are now in bounds, then that would expand by like an order of magnitude, potentially, the number of things that I would need to include on the bibliography. On my own personal blog, we've had like 1,500 substantive posts since I started it, you know, 7 years ago. Like that's a lot, and I'm not going to do it, is the short version. The other thing I'll just mention in terms of how I originally restricted the scope of the bibliography is it was originally restricted to English language materials for a very simple reason, which was that as a parochial American who's terrible with foreign languages, English is the only language that I can read. And so there wasn't any point when this was my reading list to include things in, you know, Portuguese or Romanian or Japanese. Like there just wasn't a point. But if this is meant to be a library for international global researchers to be familiar with the literature on corruption, there's not any substantive reason it should be limited to English language resources. I don't know how much really important research material is published not in English, because I don't have, again, I just don't have access to it because of my own intellectual limitations. But you know, I think that's another thing to think about going forward. So this is a long-winded way of saying a lot of the original restrictions on the scope of this project that I imposed were imposed because of the particular purpose for which it was originally intended. And now that it looks like the project has grown beyond my original purpose, I think some of the restrictions that I kind of imposed on it back in the day might not make a lot of sense anymore. And I'm not really in a position to change it for reasons I've already talked about. But I think if global integrity and the AC are kind of taking the original foundation and building something on it that goes well beyond it, it may be time for you guys to reconsider some of those things and think about ways of possibly expanding the scope of the resources that are included.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good place to end. Really appreciate everyone's thoughts today. And I think it's been just incredible kind of hearing all these stories. It's funny, I've been working on this for so long, and this is the first time I'm hearing about a lot of this stuff. So it's really great. And I hope to share the recording with everyone. And please check out the library and give us your feedback.